In this tutorial, I'll be covering the new RimWorld ideology, Slavery Mechanics. Slavery Mechanics in ideology has been significantly developed from vanilla RimWorld, where you could only sell slaves to slavers or harvest their organs, or royalty, where you could donate them to the Shattered Empire for honor. Now, slaves can become an integral part of your society. The benefits of having slaves are that they don't require recreation, they are 50% less likely to cause a social fight, and will never start a fight against a colonist. Additionally, they have lower expectations of your community, so they'll have a higher base mood value, and will ignore all work incapabilities. Slaves have drawbacks as well. If handled improperly, they can rebel, which is especially dangerous if you have a large population of slaves. Another drawback is that they have a 15% penalty to global work speed. Despite ignoring work incapabilities, slaves will become unable to hunt, make art, research, act as a warden, or work at a drug bench. Before you start enslaving people, you should probably know that depending upon the slavery precept of your ideology, your colonists may or may not want to enslave others. Some ideologies find slavery as abhorrent and will prohibit the enslavement of others and also prohibit the sale of slaves. Other ideologies may honor the precept of slavery and actually suffer mood penalties if the colony does not enslave others. If you would like slaves in your community, you must imprison the person that you intend to enslave. The resistance to becoming a slave is called will and must be reduced to 0 before the imprisoned pawn will submit to becoming a slave. Reducing the will of a slave is just about identical to the process to recruit prisoners, where you have to reduce their resistance. On average, a prisoner will have a lot lower will than resistance, which means it's easier to enslave than to recruit. Once enslaved, the new slave will ignore their previous working capabilities, but now become incapable of hunting, making art, research, wardening, or working at a drug bench. They'll require a slave bed, which is a new classification of bed, identical to that of prisoner beds and colonist beds. To note, colonists do not like sharing a barracks with slaves. Slaves that have never been recruited to your faction will continue to belong to the faction they originated from, even when converted to your ideology. This means that you can sometimes release slaves from servitude back to their faction for reputation gain, even when enslaved for a long time. To keep slaves from rebelling, you must manage the slave's suppression. Suppression is the amount of psychological fear and control the owners of the slave have upon their slaves. High suppression results in slaves that do not attempt to escape or rebel often. You suppress slaves by beating them, interacting with them with non-slave colonist wardens, or executing other slaves or prisoners with them present. A new hat called the Authority Cap will allow interacting with slaves to increase suppression to be more effective. Suppression will naturally reduce daily by between 5 to 30% unless the player actively works to negate the decay. Two very effective tools to suppress slaves are the slave collar and the slave body strap. They are pieces of clothing that you can have your slaves wear that will significantly slow down or even stop the loss of suppression. Each piece reduces suppression loss by 15% per day, which when worn together can completely stop suppression loss as long as the slave isn't wearing other clothing or armor that would negate the effect. Here is a list of clothing and armor that will encourage your slave to lose suppression. Note that armor and L-Tex clothing have a significant negative suppression modifier, which means equipping armor or psi-cast gear on slaves will cause them to lose suppression a lot faster. One of the setbacks of the slave body strap is that it takes up the outer torso layer, which means that a slave cannot wear the slave body strap with parkas or dusters, so slaves may be difficult to keep warm in cold climates or cool in hot climates. Another way to prevent suppression loss is to subject your slaves to terror-inducing objects. A slave can be affected by up to 3 different terror objects at a time. Skull spikes and gibbet cages that have corpses in them can induce 25% terror. Terror sculptures, depending on their quality, can range from 3% terror for awful sculptures to up to 40% terror for legendary ones, and caps at a total of 100% terror. Even at 100% terror, it will only slow the suppression loss by 45%. The Slave Rebellion interval is also affected by multiple other factors. The base interval is 45 days, or once in 3 seasons, that a slave will try to rebel. Here are other factors that affect slave rebellion. Moving capacity, or how fast the slave moves, can affect the rebellion interval. The faster the slave moves, the more likely they are to rebel. This means that installing peg legs, prosthetic legs, or injuring them in a way that slows them down can be an effective way to prevent rebellion. Another factor is mood. The more upset a slave is, the more likely they are to rebel. Slave count is another factor. The more slaves you have in your colony, the more likely they are to rebel. Escape route. If the slave isn't walled in by walls and doors, and can freely walk to the edge of the map without having to pass through a door, they are also more likely to rebel. A very important factor would be weapon proximity. If the slave is in a room that has weapons stored in it, this will significantly increase the chance for rebellion. Weapon proximity will also be triggered if the slave is allowed to have a weapon equipped. Weapon proximity won't be triggered by utility weapons like smoke launchers or EMP launchers, or by equipping wood as a weapon. You can also equip slaves with shield belts and wood as blunt weapons to make them fairly useful for combat, without the rebellion risk of arming them with proper weapons. Zoning your slaves not to be able to enter rooms with weapons will help to keep them from rebelling. The last and most important factor of slavery rebellion is called unattended. If the colony is composed of all slaves and nobody is to subdue them, they are extremely likely to rebel. All of these factors are totaled to calculate the frequency that your slaves will attempt to rebel or escape. I hope this slavery tutorial has helped you understand the mechanics of slavery in RimWorld ideology, and if you have any feedback or questions, feel free to share them in the comments.